Hello and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie. Religion often maintains a complicated and difficult relationship with human sexuality, especially when sexual attraction and behavior depart from what is deemed normative. In particular, Christianity often promotes a conflicted and antagonistic relationship to individuals who identify with the LGBTQ community. My guest today, Denise Levy, is an ally and advocate for LGBTQ individuals and studies what happens when a person's sexual or gender identity comes into conflict with their religious teachings. Welcome, Denise.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. I know you're very busy. You play many roles at this university, so why don't you start by just telling us what you're doing now and what your history here at Appalachian has been?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be a part of your show. So I started out at App State in 2008 as a faculty member in the Department of Social Work and had a few years as program director. And for the last 8 years, I've served as associate dean in the Beaver College of Health Sciences.
Yeah, and you're also affiliate faculty a couple of places?
That's right. Yeah, Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies. Yeah. Yep.
Oh, that's great. So in social work, how did you get directed to the type of research you have done with individuals in LGBTQ communities who also grew up in religious environments? I find that fascinating what you're doing. Yep.
Yeah, so I was trained as a clinical social worker. So when I was practicing social work in rural Georgia, rural South Georgia, I was working with kids who were having difficulties. Some were identified as at-risk youth, and I was doing therapy with them and their families, and mostly in their home environment. So I would drive around to different people's homes and provide mental health counseling and support to the kids and their families. And through that, I had a client who came out to me as gay and said he was struggling with his religion and some of the things he was hearing at his church and from his pastor about how it was a sin to be gay. And so he was really struggling with that. And I wanted to help him. I was looking for community resources. I was looking for research and information on how people resolve these kind of conflicts and helpful information for him. And I didn't really find a lot. And there's a lot more out there now, but at the time...
Well, thanks in part to you.
Well, thanks for saying that.
You're widely published now in this field, so I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. Yeah. At the time, it was really to help my client. And then also, I was working in the same community I grew up in, and I grew up with some folks who identified as part of the LGBTQ community, and who grew up in a fairly Christian community and environment, and also sort of experienced some of those same struggles. And so I saw it with my friends, I saw it with this client, and really I wanted to do anything I could to make a difference and to be an advocate.
So part of what you found, and your research is groundbreaking, and I want to get to kind of the process that you've identified a little later on. But part of what you have found in working with individuals is that while some Christian groups might be affirming and inclusive to LGBTQ individuals, more often the case is that religion is antagonistically related to LGBTQ individuals. And that's got to add a whole nother layer of stressors in the lives of folks who are struggling to figure out their identity and where they fit into the larger community.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I feel like there's what I've seen is sort of a spectrum or range of faith communities, and exactly like you said, some that are very clearly anti-LGBTQ, and they're out there, sort of campaigning for that anti-LGBTQ message that they have. And then there's some that say, well, we're tolerant, everyone's welcome here. But that may say, well, we're not going to have same-sex marriage, we're not going to ordain anyone who's LGBTQ. And then you have folks who are who say, well, we're accepting. But even the word accepting might lend itself to think, well, you're accepting something that is different from the norm, or that's not okay. So a lot of people use welcoming, affirming, that kind of language who are on that end of the spectrum. So you'll see faith communities and churches that are all along that spectrum.
How can such a wide spectrum exist? I guess let's start with the conservative part of the spectrum, where there's probably, I guess, more likely to be a kind of anti-LGBTQ message. Where does that message come from?
So, I've interviewed over the course of my research about 40 people, and then talked with countless others who weren't part of the actual studies that I've done. But I think people hear it often at the pulpit, and from the person who's leading the faith community, the pastor, the preacher, the priest, and often relying on sort of literal interpretations or more fundamentalist interpretations of certain Bible verses, and then also, in some ways there might be overt messages that people are hearing, but it's also in what's not said, or assumptions that are made, or people just assuming that someone is a straight person, or that someone is cisgender and not part of the trans community. And so even those assumptions so it can happen, those messages can come in ways that are more overt, like from the pulpit, or in more covert ways.
So in a case where the messages are overt and direct, it must be, we would like to think that religion provides a safe haven for people to seek guidance and comfort, but it must be very difficult for someone to come out in an environment like that, particularly to a religious leader who they already know is going to be antagonistically oriented toward them, toward their orientation.
Yes, that's exactly right. And it creates an environment where often people feel shame, or they feel silenced, or they're not really sure where to turn. And there's a lot more resources now. There's a lot of welcoming and affirming groups that you can find online. What used to be called the Gay Christian Network, which is now, I think, like the Q Christian Fellowship. That's a group that has a large internet presence. A lot of folks I've talked to who grew up before access to the internet, they were going to the library to try to find books and materials and information, because anything that they got in their faith communities was far from affirming.
So it must be a really radical sense of isolation within some of these faith communities, I would guess.
Yeah.
Oh. So on the other end of the spectrum, more affirming Christian communities, where does that sense of affirmation and inclusion come from?
Yeah, so I think those communities are really important to, or can be really important to folks who are dealing with sort of this identity struggle or conflict between their religion and their sexuality or their gender. If they find an affirming group, that can be really helpful to them. And in resolving the conflict, maybe in meeting other people that are also queer and Christian, and seeing, oh, this is possible. Here's an example of someone who is both of these identities that I also feel like I hold and want to explore. And so I think those welcoming communities can be really helpful. I've also heard a few people say something a little unexpected, which is, I found this church, they're really welcoming, but it's all about being LGBTQ and Christian, and like, I just want to go to church and not to hear that same message, it's okay to be gay. They're like, I get that. Right. I'm past that. So it's that was just a few people, but I thought that was really interesting that they had that perspective too.
So tell me a little bit about your method. How do
Sure.
you go out into the field, and how do you identify people to be part of the study? What's the interview like, and so forth?
So for me, as someone who's an ally and who's not part of either of these, I don't identify as a Christian, and I'm not part of the LGBTQ community.
Tell me about the word ally, because I think it has a little bit of
Sure.
and then you can go on. So I just
Yeah, so ally is someone who I think of it as someone who is not part of a community, but who's an advocate, who wants to, to speak up, to speak out for justice, for equity, for fairness, and so that's how I think of it.
so when you interview people, I mean, this is known, right? That you don't identify as queer, you don't identify as Christian,
Right.
so.
And I'll at the beginning, people may see a flyer in a community center or at a welcoming church about my research. And the very first thing I do when someone reaches out to me is I have just a short phone call with them to tell them about who I am and what I'm doing, because a lot of, they might not know me, they might not know what are my motives.
Right.
Why do I want to talk to them? And so I want to share with people a little bit like what I have, here at the beginning with you about my journey, my strong identification as an ally and an advocate, and that I'm really doing this because I want to help other people who are going through these kind of conflicts, but also my background as a social worker, as a counselor, I want to be able to provide resources also for helping professionals so that they can be better equipped to help people.
So in the process of interviewing, do you find that it takes a while to break down some of the walls of suspicion and develop a kind of sense of trust?
I thought that perhaps that would be the case, but what I have found more is that people are really hungry to talk about their stories and to share their stories, and often they haven't had any other place to talk about this journey that is so personal to them. And I've had people say, in my queer community, I really can't talk about being religious, and in my religious community, I can't really talk about being queer. So it's this is like the first time I've ever talked about both of these identities. And so that's why I think the interview piece is so important, because this is such a personal experience for people. And so providing a place they feel comfortable. I've gone to people's homes. I've rented secured a room at a local library to meet with people. I've met with people in my office. I'll go to where they're comfortable and meet with them in a place that's confidential, where it's just the two of us, and they can really share their stories, which are quite emotional.
Oh. And we use the word intersectionality a lot around campus, and it's really a way of talking about how people see themselves, how they identify, and how those identities come together. And sometimes there's conflict with those identities, and that's really what you're talking about here, right? So it seems like your work would be particularly important in a situation where someone can't, as you said, can't really come out to their minister or their priest, maybe have difficulty talking to family members or being public about their identities or their orientations. So that's where intersectionality research really becomes important.
Yeah, I agree. And in some cases, some of the folks I've talked to, their family members are the leaders at their churches. So, that kind of makes it even doubly difficult for them. But yeah, certainly the intersectionality of lots of different identities, this research fits in well with that concept. And even, identities around culture or race and ethnicity. I mean, I think that comes into play too. And I've had folks that I've interviewed talked about the importance of all of these different intersections of the different parts of their identity. They're one whole person, but they have all these different pieces, and the way that they intersect is important. Yeah.
At one point in your writing, you talked about how many individuals in the LGBTQ community come to a crossroads, and they have to make a choice whether to be, I think in your words, authentic or accepted. And oftentimes what happens is that religion can drive a wedge between individuals and their broader community, maybe even between individuals and their family. You told a story about Mark, who came out to his family, and the family decided to side with their religious tradition rather than with their child.
That's right.
Oh.
And so, and of course, Mark is a pseudonym or fake name.
Sure, yes.
And when I interviewed him, he's the very first person I interviewed for my dissertation. So that was 18 years ago or so. And he said, I came out to my mother and my sister, and he was 18, and they essentially kicked him out of the house. And it had been 10 years, and he had spoken to them 1 or 2 times. And so he was very gracious. And I remember distinctly him saying, well, it took me 18 years of my life to come out to them, so I'm going to give them 18 years to accept it. and I thought, gosh, it had been 10 years, and I mean, that was he had nowhere to go. He had no one. His family was really his life. So it is family and community play a huge role in this process for folks. And I'll just mention too that when I have done the research that I've taught with people who say that they feel like they've resolved conflict between their sexual gender identity and their religion. So I haven't taught with folks who still feel unresolved about things or who are still working through it. And so part of that is so that I can sort of talk with folks who've resolved it and see what that process looked like for them. But, there are so many people who never feel like they come to a resolution and who are just in it.
So this is where I think your research kind of departs from what has gone before. You are looking for commonalities in the lives of people who have resolved the conflict between their orientation and their religious tradition, and you found some commonalities there. So you can talk about process of resolution. Maybe we can say a little word about that, and I think we have some charts here that you've put together to help illustrate that. But at one point, the way I read your work is that there are certain steps toward resolution and awareness, so forth. How does a person, what do you see as the process of working toward resolution of this conflict between orientation and religious faith?
So what I would say is that when I first started out in my first study, which was my dissertation, and that was with people who are gay, lesbian, and queer, I thought of it more like steps, like you're saying, sort of these linear steps. And then as I continued my research, focused some on gender identity, looked at folks who identify as bisexual and pansexual. In those other studies, I began to really understand that it'd be nice to put things in a nice linear chart with steps, and that sounds good, but it's really a lot more fluid than that. And part of that is people are sort of going along and thinking things are kind of good and they've resolved things, and then something comes up. Or even during the pandemic, sometimes folks had to they had been able to live their lives up until that point, no longer interacting with faith communities, but perhaps they had to interact with a faith community to get social services or some kind of resources during the pandemic, and all of a sudden it brought up those emotions again, and those feelings. So yes, there's certainly some. I would say there's still kind of a process that we can look at, but it's a lot messier than what it might look like in the charts.
Okay. Well, let's look at some charts, okay, and then maybe you can point out the messy part.
Yeah.
This chart, I think you made to describe some of your initial research with gay and queers and LGBTQ individuals.
Yeah. So this study was with folks who identify as gay, lesbian, and queer. And so it's just looking at sexual identity, and you can see like, it looks like, this is the one that looks like nice, neat boxes. That isn't quite this way, but sort of what it's illustrating is you start out with an awareness that there's some conflict between sexual orientation and religion. And then interestingly, the initial response for all the participants I talked to was, I got to keep this a secret. I can't let anyone know about my sexuality.
Well, of course, if they're told that they're sinful in their sexuality.
Right.
Yeah.
And then also this piece about increased religious involvement. So if I pray enough, if I, go to youth group, if I read my Bible enough, if I do all of the things, then maybe this issue will just go away. And so there was sort of this initial response to become more religious, and maybe that would help sort of, eliminate this conflict for them. But that didn't work. And so in some cases, depression set in, and some folks kind of stayed in that initial response for a while until there was some kind of catalyst. And for a lot of people, that was they found something online, they found a library book, they met someone who was gay and Christian, they heard about some church that was welcoming. It's something like, oh, this is possible. I can be both of these things, and I am both of these things. And so that really led to, sort of seeking more information, reflecting, discussing, trying out new things, and eventually this idea of a more personalized faith. And I think that's true across all of the research that I've done, is that I don't have to take what someone is telling me, that this is what the Bible means, or this is how you need to believe and what you need to believe. I can figure it out for myself and come to my own personalized faith. And that may be Christian, and it may be spiritual, it may be atheist, it may be something else. But interestingly, even in this study, I talked with a couple of people who identified as atheist or agnostic, but they still use the word faith. And so I asked about that, and they said, well, it's really more like faith in humanity and like hope that eventually things will get better.
So this is the nice, neat process.
Yeah.
And at the end, you have acceptance of sexual identity along with a kind of personalized faith. But let's say someone goes through steps similar to these and they leave the church entirely. This would be your atheist. That's still a type of resolution, right?
It is. Yeah. And for a lot of people, that's what it is. For a lot of folks, they leave the church and maybe they find a different faith group or a different church, or maybe they leave religion altogether.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's look at the second chart here. Is this a messier one? Or
a little bit more fluid.
Okay.
Yeah. So this was the study. Actually, did this once I got here to App State, and so this was with folks who identify as trans. So I was really looking at the conflict between gender identity and religion, and at that time, you would hear a lot of churches talking about sexuality, but until more recently, not a lot of churches talked about anything related to trans individuals or gender identity. And so it was really interesting because people were experiencing a conflict, but it wasn't, they were like, yeah, my church isn't saying, it's a sin to be trans. They don't even know what it means to be trans.
Right.
And so this was a little different. And in this study, folks, all of the people I talked to in this one still identified as Christian, but again, sort of at the end, that same piece about having a more personalized faith. And interestingly, though, none of the participants, even though they identified as Christian, none of them were regularly attending church. And they said, I just don't know what would happen if I walked into church and people took one look at me and they said, I expect people will stare at me. I expect people will wonder, who is that person? And particularly for people who perhaps have transitioned.
Right.
So.
Yeah. So even though you said churches or traditional religious communities may not even be aware at this point of what it means to be trans, they're still kind of reinforcing very strict and traditional gender roles in many cases. So there's a kind of model or paradigm that people are expected to conform to.
Right, and especially in some of the more, we were talking earlier about more conservative churches that, even have rules about who can serve as leaders in the church or priests or pastors based on gender.
Yeah. Well, let's look at the third chart. Yeah, this is the most fluid of them all, right?
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about
and
this.
the most recent. So I think I've come to understand like it's very fluid. So this was with, when I did my dissertation, I really wanted to talk to everyone, and my advisor rightly said, try to narrow your focus. So in this last study, it's with folks who identify as bisexual, pansexual, and so there were some similarities, but I would say there were some pieces that were very unique, and a lot of myths or sayings that they would hear, like, oh, it's just a phase, or you're like, for a lot of bisexual and pansexual people, they were hearing things like, oh, well, eventually you'll just be gay or lesbian, like this is just a phase you're going through on the way to that. And so they kind of had a little bit of a different experience, even though there are a lot of similarities, especially to that first graph.
Yeah. I like where you begin and where you end, dissonance and authentic living. Hopefully we can all figure out how to work through those stages to get to authentic living.
Yeah, and those, a lot of these are called codes in the research that I do, in the qualitative research, I'm coding. And a lot of these words and these themes come from the words of the participants in the interviews. So these are the words that they used. And authenticity is certainly a theme and something really important.
So for those of us who are in privileged positions in society, who might want to be an ally and an advocate, how does one go about that? Education, awareness, promotion. What advice could you give to someone?
Well, I think it's all of that. I think it's being aware of what's happening in the policy world. Where can we do some advocacy there? But it's also our day-to-day conversations, and sometimes that's the most important thing. And sometimes I can go into spaces that perhaps an LGBTQ person might not feel comfortable or safe going into, and I think what's called often in my field of social work, intergroup dialogue. So having dialogue with people who are part of different groups, who have different beliefs, but ongoing and deep conversations over time. I think it helps with understanding. I think it can really make a difference. And so I think even our day-to-day conversations, interrupting, when we see things happening that are disparaging or where there's discrimination happening, interrupting that and saying why. And I don't always have the right words, and sometimes I think later, man, I wish I would have said that, but I always think, I'll go back. If it's somebody that I know, I'll go back and have that conversation again. But I think it's all important from sort of the macro advocacy of policy change down to those everyday conversations we can have.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been a lovely chat, and your work is so important, and I'm glad you're continuing in it.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Well, this is Ozzie Ostwalt for Religion and Life, and we'll hope you'll join us next week when we continue to explore the interaction between religion and culture. Until then, goodbye.